By the end of this series, you'll see how a Tier 1 infrastructure position is built from scratch, and why the real mechanism behind it is almost never explained publicly. Ownership isn't what it looks like. There's a system underneath everything: money, markets, infrastructure, that decides who actually controls value. Most people never see it. I call it the ghost protocol. And once you see it, you start to notice something. The things you think you own, you don't actually control. Not your money, not your assets, not even your position in the way you think. Because ownership isn't possession, it's structure. And right now, that structure is changing. Quietly, systemically, and very fast. Which means, what you own today won't remain what you think you own. Take something simple: your money. You open your banking app, you see a number, and you assume that's yours. But what you're actually looking at is a representation, not control. That number exists inside a system with rules you didn't write and don't control. Access can be restricted, transfers can be delayed, accounts can be frozen. And when that happens, you realize something very quickly. You don't own it in the way you thought. You're interacting with a structure that holds it on your behalf. And this isn't a flaw, it's the design. Because ownership, in modern systems, is separated from control. And once you see that, you start to notice it everywhere. Brokerage accounts, digital platforms, market positions. You're not holding the asset. You're holding permission. Permission inside someone else's system. And that system decides how, when, and if you can act. So the real question isn't, what do you own? It's, what do you actually control? Because once you shift that lens, money stops looking like money and starts looking like infrastructure. Once you see ownership this way, money stops behaving like money. It starts behaving like infrastructure, a system of rails, rules, and permissions designed to move value, but only within defined boundaries. And those boundaries aren't visible at the surface. They sit underneath, in settlement layers, clearing systems, institutional controls, which means every transaction you make isn't just a transfer. It's a request that gets processed, validated, and either approved or delayed. And most of the time, you don't notice that process, because when it works, it feels instant. When it doesn't, you realize how little control you actually have. This is what I mean by legacy latency. Not just speed, but dependency. Dependency on systems you don't see and can't influence. At higher levels, this isn't treated as money at all. It's treated as flow. Flow between systems, between entities, across controlled environments. And once you start looking at it this way, you stop asking, how much do I have? And start asking, where is it sitting and what governs it? Because if you can't see the structure, you can't manage the flow. And most people never move past the surface, which is why they misunderstand assets completely. Because an asset isn't just something you hold. It's something that exists inside a system. This is where it starts to matter. Because when most people think about assets, they think about objects, property, stocks, collectibles, something tangible, something they can point to and say, that's mine. But the object isn't the asset. The structure around it is. Because every asset, physical or digital, exists inside a system, a legal system, a financial system, a platform. And that system defines who owns it, who can transfer it, what it's worth, and how it moves. Change the system, and you change the asset. Not the object, the asset. This is why entire categories of value have been misunderstood. people focused on the surface and missed the structure. When digital assets started appearing, most people thought the idea was the asset itself. It wasn't. The idea was programmable ownership, the ability to define, in code, how an asset exists, moves, and behaves. That's the shift, not from physical to digital, but from static to structured. Because once you understand that, you realize something else. Any asset can be redefined, not by changing what it is, but by changing the system it lives in, and that's already happening. Quietly, infrastructure is being built to translate value across systems, which means the question is no longer, what is this asset? It's, how is this asset structured? And where can it move? And this is where things change, because this isn't theoretical. The structure is already shifting. Slowly, quietly. The way value is defined, held, and moved is being rewritten. Across financial systems, across digital infrastructure, across asset layers. Not at the surface, underneath it. New systems are emerging that don't just store value, they define it. They control how it behaves, how it moves, and who can interact with it. Which means ownership is no longer static. It's conditional, programmable, and increasingly system-dependent. So if you're still thinking in terms of accounts, balances, assets as objects, you're already behind the shift, because the advantage now isn't in what you hold. It's in how well you understand the systems that hold it, how clearly you can see structure, how effectively you can manage flow, and how quickly you can adapt as those systems change. Because at this level, you're not reacting to systems, you're operating within them, and that requires something most people don't have. Clarity. Not more information. Structured thinking. The ability to see what matters, ignore what doesn't, and act with precision. Because once you understand the system, you stop guessing and start operating. Most people will never see this, not because it's hidden, but because they're not looking for it. They stay at the surface, balances, assets, interfaces, and assume that's ownership. But underneath all of that, there's a system defining everything. Who controls value, how it moves, where it can exist. And that system is changing. Quietly, continuously, without announcement. Which means the gap is widening between people who understand it and people who don't. And that gap is where everything happens. Because once you see it, you don't go back to thinking in terms of assets. You think in terms of systems. You don't focus on what you hold. You focus on what you control. And you start building around that understanding. Deliberately. Quietly. Precisely. Because in the end, ownership was never the point. Structure was. And once you understand the structure, you understand everything that sits on top of it. This is the Ghost Protocol. And this is just the first layer.